Hi everyone, in this video we're going to look at how to convert on a king and pawn versus king endgame. The first thing to understand about this endgame is that you must lead the way down the board with your king. So I've often heard this described as the horse leading the cart. If we imagine that the king is the horse and the pawn is the cart, then the horse needs to lead the cart down the board towards the queening square. Black, for his part, is going to do everything he can to stand in the way of that, and so the black king will always be in front of the white king, looking to block progress. And this brings us on to the second key concept about this endgame, which is what's known as the opposition. So in this position we can see that the two kings are standing opposite each other here, and the three squares between them are mutually controlled by both of the kings. Therefore, whichever side has to move now is going to be forced to give ground on this key file which is leading the way to the queening square. In this instance, it's black to move, so if we imagine that black sidesteps one square to the right, black now is controlling these three squares, and so white is now able to make progress down the board by moving diagonally up and across by one square. Black, for his part, now may take a sidestep back in order to put the king on the file that's blocking the pawn again. And this is where we have a critical position and a decision point for white. There's one correct way to play here, and there's one incorrect way to play here. So if you want to have a think about what you would play in this position in order to play the correct move, then I'd pause the video right now and have a look at it. The incorrect way to play here would be to move the pawn on d2. Whether you move the pawn forward one square or two squares, it doesn't actually matter, it's still an incorrect move. And the reason being, by moving the pawn, you now allow black to take the opposition. So black can now sidestep to the left hand side, putting the king opposite the white king, and they've taken the opposition. And it's now impossible for white to actually get back the opposition. So let's say white takes a step backwards, black comes in front of the pawn, white now comes to the right hand side in order to hold on to the pawn. Black can now step backwards again. White can come to the right hand side to try and make progress up the board. But once again, black steps in front. White can throw in a check here. Black steps in front. And we get this same pattern all the way down the board. Until eventually we reach this position here, which is stalemate. White is controlling these two squares with the king, and the pawn is controlling these two squares, which means that black is now completely boxed in and it's stalemate. And it's important to show this position not just so you understand how it can go wrong for white, but also so you understand how to make the draw with black. If we now run it back to this critical position, this is where the key concept of the king leading the way really kicks in. So here, instead of advancing the pawn, white should instead move his king and keep the opposition. So white can come one square to the right hand side here, and once again they've taken the opposition. Black now has to give ground in one way or another, so we'll move them to the side, and this is where white can now step to the opposite flank, and we're making steady progress down the board. If the black king tries to come down here, then we can move the pawn forward and give a check, at which point they'll have to retreat. And again, as the white player, we have a decision to make. Do we advance the pawn and check the king, or do we instead move our own king down the board? And this is where we need to fall back on the principles that we've learnt earlier, that the king should lead the way down the board. So here, we should move the king down the board in order to maintain the opposition from the side. And again, this is something to remember, that the opposition can apply not just for front-on kings, but also when the kings are side to side like this. By moving the king here, we're now creating a safe passageway through to the queening square. Black now gives ground by coming backwards. Now as the white player, in theory, we continue mirroring the black king, but the problem here is that then black just comes back to where we were, and we can't advance the pawn or else it will be taken. So if we run it back, black's just moved here, we can't advance the pawn, so we would now have to retreat with the white king, and we're back in the position we started from and haven't made progress. So that's why when black moves the king backwards down the board here, now we do advance the pawn by a space in order to actually make progress. Black has to give ground again, And once again, one move leads to a draw, one move leads to a win. Moving the pawn is a draw. Black's now got the opposition over white. Moving the king into d6 is a win. White has the opposition, black is forced to give ground, and white can now step in, and the pawn has a clear run to the queening square. Just to show this finishing out, this is the position we would get. And from here, white can now execute the queen and king checkmate. I have covered that checkmate in another video, which I'll link in a card now, so if you do want to check that out, then follow the card on screen above you. Guys, I hope that video really helps you understand this king and pawn endgame, and you can use it to great effect in your own games. If you have any questions, do let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I hope to see you again in another video.